From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, May 1st. Have you ever had that feeling when you're sitting in a room and you're not totally sure what everyone is talking about? Well, if that's happened to you at the state legislature lately, we can't blame you. Lawmakers have increasingly relied on what are known as placeholder bills, and it makes it even more difficult to track what policies are being considered in Salem. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle agree it can pose problems for transparency. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk, VanderHart.
Before we get started, I will just point out we are trying something new on the podcast this week. Dirk, we are live streaming to the YouTubes. This is new for us.
The people have been clamoring for it. We have these fancy cameras. I'm wearing a nicely pressed shirt, and we are ready to go.
We're doing this. So if you've been aching for a behind-the-scenes look at our show, this episode is live on opb.org/livestream and on OPB's YouTube page. All right,
see you there.
Here we go. Back to the subject, placeholder bills. Okay, this topic might feel a little insidery to some people, but it's quite important.
Yeah.
Give us a quick primer on what exactly placeholder bills are.
Yeah, placeholder bills are very insidery, but they are exactly what they sort of sound like. They are bills filed by lawmakers for the express purpose of holding a spot for a bill that is going to come along later. And they're pretty easy to identify, as you know, Lauren. They are always sort of very short bills directing some agency or another to study some subject or another. For instance, you might be directing the Oregon Health Authority to study healthcare, or a classic example is directing the Department of Transportation to study speed bumps. No one wants a speed bump study, which actually took me a while to learn when I first covered the legislature. But no one wants a speed bump study. Those bills are filed in case they're needed later on, in which case they can be gutted and stuffed. They replaced with an amendment that actually puts some substantive content into a bill. And they're nothing new, we should say. I spoke with a longtime lawmaker, Greg Smith, who said one of the first things he learned in the legislature coming in 2001 was how to use placeholder bills. So nothing new, but being used a lot.
All right, let's step back and just sort of set the scene here, because early in this session, you spotted that there were a lot of placeholder bills. But then one morning, you looked at a committee hearing and you saw this bill to study parole law in the state and report back.
Right.
And then that turned into something much more significant.
Yeah, this was Senate Bill 469, and we talk about it a lot in a story I wrote because it is prototypical, I think, of the way these bills can pose a problem. So this bill got a public hearing on April 1st. It was the public's only chance to testify in favor or against the bill. But like you said, anyone in the public sort of watching the legislative agenda would have seen just that, a bill to study parole law. Probably not something a lot of people really care about, not something people want to sign up to talk about. What became very clear, though, in the early parts of this hearing was that was not the bill that was actually being taken up. It was actually potentially a bill that would have done something a lot more weighty. It would have changed the way Oregon grants parole to convicted murderers. The problem was there wasn't an amendment reflecting that proposal. The amendment actually wouldn't be ready until the next day. So to me, to you, to any member of the public, even to a lot of lobbyists that really know what they're talking about, there was absolutely no notice that something was coming up to this effect. In fact, the only people that knew this was coming were the interest groups trying to push this policy. So, state prosecutors had opposed this in the past. Victims' rights group had opposed this in the past. Suddenly, without any notice, it was getting a hearing. It was actually something I'd never seen before, and I will be honest, it struck me as, I've covered Salem for a long time, as a serious lapse of public process in a building that often says transparency is key.
Right. So a bill that looked like, again, it was just going to study something, was actually going to overhaul the entire state process for paroling convicted murderers, which is pretty substantive.
Something you might want to let people know is coming up for consideration.
Right. you found a lot of examples of this happening. Tell us about some of the other ones.
Yeah, so I hadn't seen that before. Like I said, I think it's happened in past years. I just hadn't seen it. But I didn't have to wait long for another example because the very next day, I was watching a House hearing, and once again, there was a bill that came up that I think said to study liquor laws in the state or something, direct the OLCC to study liquor laws. In fact, this was exactly the same thing we had seen the day before. There was an amendment that hadn't been released publicly that was going to change the way state liquor stores are regulated. In fact, maybe give them slightly lesser penalties if they sell to minors. But no one had been given a chance to see it. No one would have known to come and testify in that hearing or on that bill because it had just not been issued publicly. Now, that is an extreme. I mean, both of those two examples are pretty extreme. I think the way placeholders usually work that can cause some concern is lawmakers will unveil an amendment a short time before the hearing, right? So we saw one instance this year where in the House Judiciary Committee, they unveiled a pretty weighty amendment that would require gun dealers to get some new state license less than a day before the hearing. Now, gun issues are always a big deal in Salem. When this bill came up for public hearing, we heard from a lot of folks that advocate for gun rights that this was being rushed. This was kind of being snuck through. They hadn't had much time to really prepare or mobilize and speak against this bill. I spoke with a guy named Dirk LeBlanc. He's a Eugene firearms instructor. He advocates for gun rights, and here's what he put it about this kind of process.
It's overwhelming. It really is. And a lot of it I feel like is by design. And I feel that these people up here that we elect, right, they're all elected. They do it to keep us off balance, to keep us in the dark.
And, that typifies the kind of thing you hear from people that become aware of this placeholder process and aren't a fan of it. The people that really don't like the bills that are being proposed and think that these are policies that are kind of being put forward in an unfair or sneaky way.
I mean, it's already a little bit tricky sometimes to track a bill through the whole process, unless you're a lawmaker, a lobbyist, or a political journalist.
For me, it's tricky.
Or yes,
frankly.
or even, yes, one of those. There are always these last-minute amendments. Bills are jumping through different committees, jumping through different chambers. So this really makes it difficult for people to offer informed testimony, to really engage in the process as most everyone says they want them to. Just remind us, why lawmakers are doing this.
I mean, everyone I spoke to for this story say placeholder bills have a place. I'm not sure that they would agree with all the ways they've been used, but the reason these are used is because of the timing of session and how deadlines work, right? So as you know, Lauren, lawmakers ahead of session have this really nice, at least ahead of long sessions and odd years, have this really nice privilege, which they can request an unlimited number of bills. They can ask the legislature's attorneys to draft 60, 70 bills. Some lawmakers do that, right? That changes pretty quickly when the session begins. I think several weeks in, suddenly that privilege of requesting unlimited bills is gone. I think lawmakers get 5 what are known as priority bills for the rest of session. And so how these placeholders come in handy is lawmakers realize they don't have to be tied to those 5 bills. If they put a bunch of placeholders in, then they can reserve their spot. They can reserve bill numbers for themselves later in session should something come up or should they have a law that they have in mind. Maybe it's not ready. I spoke with a longtime lobbyist named Tom Holt. He's been in Salem for 30 years, has seen a lot of this. Here's how he thinks of placeholders, or part of the way he thinks of it.
There's a place for placeholder bills. Good committee chairs always have a handful ready with broad relating clauses that are there for, if something unexpected comes up.
So we're going to get really wonky here. Bear with me, Lauren. He just mentioned relating to clauses, and those are super important when it comes to these placeholder bills because the state's constitution contains a provision that says every bill can only take up one subject, right? When a bill is drafted, it has what's known as a relating to clause. And that has to do with placeholder bills in terms of what is being studied. So I mentioned the speed bump study, right? That bill is going to have a relating to clause that is something like relating to speed bumps or relating to transportation, right? In any case, it will be limited to those subjects. So that relating to transportation bill, no matter what's done to it, will never be able to contain a policy that relates to health care or relates to criminal justice. They are limited. So what you see is lawmakers more and more, I would say, filing bills strategically to get relating to clauses that might have broad applicability, holding it in their back pocket and waiting for something to come to use. And that's where some of this transparency concerns can arise.
Well, like you've mentioned, this process has been around for a long time, but why has it exploded this session?
I don't know why it's exploded this session. I've asked a lot of people that, and there is I think, just an acknowledgement that the culture has evolved around this. But what we can say definitively is it has exploded. And I saw this early in session. I asked leadership about it, but I didn't have a lot of numbers to tie it to. Actually, we just got, I think, last week, more hard numbers about how this has worked. And what they show is in the last decade, this has absolutely exploded. So in 2015, lawmakers, I think, filed fewer than 40 placeholder bills. They were about 1% of the total bills that were filed in the 2015 long session. This year, they filed 615 or more, according to the Legislative Counsel's office. That is almost 1 in 5 bills that have been filed this year, or a record year for bills, are placeholder bills. So there is no question that these things are being used more and more. And I think that's why I'm feeling like there's some transparency issues. Members of the public, even members of the lobby, are feeling like more and more transparency issues are arising.
Yeah, that is so many. And there is one lawmaker in particular who has relied on these placeholder bills quite a bit.
Yeah. We talk a lot in the story I wrote about Senator Floyd Przansky. He's the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's used these forever. Actually, some people kind of see him as an early adopter of this and someone who's really kind of helped the process get to where it is. But he uses them a lot. So he has 5 attorneys that work with him in his Judiciary Committee. They think ahead of session about the broad scope of what kind of bills they might want to order up. This year, he ordered, I believe, 72 placeholder bills up prior to the session starting, which is every lawmaker I cited that number to was sort of gobsmacked, because most people are like, yeah, I might do 5. We want to have something here and there. 70 is, I think, an extreme example of how this is used. Przansky even suggested that it had gotten a little out of hand. He didn't realize that it was going to be quite this much. But he would argue, like all other lawmakers, that they are very useful tools. One
thing I found kind of amusing in your story was that Przansky, also kind of just lends out these placeholders.
Yeah.
So when Representative David Gomberg's bill to block the state from spending money on experimenting on cats and dogs died,
Yep.
He just went to Przansky, and Przansky had his back because he had this bill that included the due clause relating to animals. And Gomberg could just put his policy, gut and stuff it right into that policy bill, and off they go.
Yeah, it died in the House. Gomberg gets it in the Senate. I think it's passed the Senate now, or at least it's moving. I mean, this is part of the way these things are used. They can be political currency in the building. And actually, that is not an atypical example. When I talked to Senator Przansky about this, he mentioned that this is a pretty common thing.
It's not uncommon for something to be originating on the House side that doesn't make it through for whatever reason, and a member will ask, they'll see that we have something, and they'll ask if it's something that can be used.
And he gave me another example of this where the way he put it is there was a bill that people had been planning to file about expanding how police can use drones in police work. But somewhere wires got crossed. They didn't file the bill, and people are freaking out. Well, Przansky had probably one of many relating to clauses around law enforcement. He was happy to give it to them. He supported their policy. And so that bill now lives. So that is an example of, I think, some of the more common ways these are used.
I think it was also Przansky's bill, right, that we took up at the beginning of this podcast, the
Yep.
one that looked at studying parole but was really much bigger. Did he comment to you about that bill?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to sit down with him, because I wanted to see how he justified that process. And I think he was pretty clear that that was not great process, something he would want to avoid. Ultimately, the bill died. But yeah, here's how he put it.
It's not my intent to bring something in that has not had a public process with it. I mean, that is something that is important to me. That particular bill, whether it was or wasn't posted, was not going to be moving forward.
So Brzezinski says his whole intention with this parole bill was not to pass it. He says he wanted to send a message to the parole board that he is serious about reforming some of their practices, and that by introducing this bill, he could, I guess, fire a shot across the bow and let them know that this was going to be something he'd be considering. I will say, though, SB 469, the way this thing died was pretty interesting because, we watched the public hearing. I watched this hearing. I was a little bit curious, a little bit incensed by the way this had played out. And so I reached out to folks who had opposed this in the past, the DA's lobby. It seemed pretty clear that they had not caught that this had come up again either. In fact, their lobbyist said, you are the only one that caught this. They pretty quickly launched an opposition campaign. So they sent a letter to some senators, or at least one senator. Some victims' rights groups did. And the next day, Brzezinski announced that the bill wouldn't be moving forward because it hadn't had enough public testimony. So that's hard to say exactly how it all played out.
Is there anyone that told you, hey, yes, this is how democracy should work in the dark?
No. And like I said, anyone I talked to about sort of that 469 example or the one about liquor laws, bills that were taken up without the actual policy being made public before a public hearing, everyone disavowed that. I think no one would ever cop to that being good process. And I think they say this is what happens when there's so many bills and things are getting rushed. But everyone says, like I say, there is a place for placeholders, for times when the truly unexpected happens. And there's also an interesting argument I heard that putting placeholders down is better than introducing a bill that's not ready, that you kind of know what you want to do, but maybe you don't know quite what, because that tends to engender panic. The person who told me this was former state senator Michael Dembrow, who used these on and off during his time in the legislature. Here's what he said.
People will, request a bill that it's a potential solution to a problem, but they haven't really thought it through. And then it comes out and people freak out, as soon as it comes out.
So I think that's a very interesting argument for why these make sense in some instances. Most people say they have a place. Not everyone. Republican leaders I spoke with in both chambers take a very, very dim view of placeholders because they just really see them as a constant threat. They are in the super minority. Democrats hold all the cards, and they see these bills really as time bombs that could always go off if Democrats decide they have some new idea that maybe Republicans think are harmful. I think this was best put by Senate Minority Leader Daniel Bonham.
We flag things that it's like, I have to watch this Senate bill forever because the relating to clause is something that could destroy our economy, could end private rights, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, we more so than ever before are seeing too many broad relating to clauses that are just a placeholder bill that are waiting.
Christine Drazan, the House Republican leader, said, I think she called these like the absolute example of absolute power, the purest example of absolute power, and Democrats abuse them. But Republicans, let's be clear, do file these. I mentioned Greg Smith. He files, I think he said around 15 every long session. So Republicans see some use for these too.
And I do think maybe there's an element here that people sometimes forget that lawmakers in Salem are part-time lawmakers. A lot of them hold other jobs. They're lawyers, they're teachers that pay them.
Yeah.
And so they're part-time. There are these time crunches. And I'm just wondering if sometimes it's kind of meant to be a time saver because they can't dedicate all their attention to policymaking.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. But a couple things I would say to that are, this is pretty new, right? We've had a part-time legislature for a very long time, and this is more and more new. And that time-saving piece, I think, comes with a real trade-off, because what we often see with placeholders that get moved into substantive bills is that they are moved pretty late in the process, right before committees need to vote bills out. And so all of a sudden, late in the session, you're suddenly introducing a substantive piece of policy that might have real unintended consequences or not, and you don't have any time to solicit enough public opinion to talk it through enough because it's just a brand new piece of policy that's landed right before the deadline. And so lawmakers are then pushing these things on. They're not as considered as they should be, and it's just an example of probably not the way we should be making laws in this state.
I think along a similar vein here is that this session there was just an intense crush of bills. Like the sheer number, there was more than 3,000 bills, 600 placeholders. For some committee hearings, we saw they held these marathon long hearings. And for others, it meant really like the public was limited to 1 or 2 minutes to testify. I think this issue, just the sheer number of bills, is also really posing a problem about transparency as well.
It is, and there is a fascinating debate in Salem about whether that's actually true. So we have seen now the top Democrats in both chambers and actually a bipartisan group of lawmakers proposing a bill that would limit all legislators, I believe, to 25 bills a session, and agencies could do some bills, and actually the House Speaker and the Senate President wouldn't really have any actual limits, but there seems to be some real momentum toward limiting bills. Here's the thing, Lauren, we don't have to consider all these bills. Just because there are 3,000 bills doesn't mean we need to have 3,000 hearings. And, I think in Congress or maybe in some other state legislatures where people are a little more willing to hurt people's feelings, they just don't hear the bills. Like the people who are the committee chairs say, I have this list of things I want to do. I'm sorry. I know you have 500 other things that you would like me to hear, but here's what we're doing. And I think the way the political cachet works in Salem, people are just really reticent to burn those bridges by not giving these bills hearings, and that leads to some of the rushed process. But I have not seen as much seeming momentum for bill limits in my time covering Salem as we do right now. So maybe that bill gets a hearing, maybe it doesn't. One thing I think we need to note, Lauren, is this is not unique to Oregon. Other legislatures, have things like placeholder bills. I surveyed a bunch of my colleagues that cover state houses around the country, and many of them came back. They call them different things. There's slightly different processes. It was pretty few and far between the states that had taken meaningful action to try to limit this kind of thing. So it's not just us, but I think I felt like it was important to highlight this because it's exploded so much, because I had seen some really egregious public process lapses. And just, I think lawmakers need to think through and be conscientious about how they're doing these things.
Great. Well, Dirk, let's leave the conversation there today. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Lauren.
Also, keep your eye out for Dirk's reporting on this bill. It should be at opb.org in the coming days, and it includes words like tomfoolery and switcheroo. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. While we have you here, today marks the beginning of OPB's Spring Membership Drive. If you value this podcast and deeply reported stories like Dirk nerding out on placeholder bills, show us some love. Click the big red Contribute Now button on our website, opb.org. In these uncertain times, we are certain you have questions about local politics. Maybe we can answer them. We would love to hear from you. Email us at opbpoliticsnow@opb.org. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.